Hey, Jesse.
Hey, Julia.
So you've been reading about the simulation argument too, right?
And having the argument myself with some of my friends.
Oh, really? Me too.
Yeah.
Probably between the two of us, we've introduced 10 new people to this maddening argument.
Actually, somebody else introduced it to me. My friend Mike was trying to
Ah.
convince me that we lived in a simulation. And
Oh, so he
we've
really
had-
buys it, huh?
He does. Or at least he did. I think we might have... I might have talked him out of it somewhat. We'll see.
Interesting. You know, I always assumed, I know a lot of people who espouse this argument, but I always assumed that they just espouse it because it's such a cool idea. I mean, not just that we might be living in a simulation, which is kind of cool in and of itself, but the whole idea that we could reason about, we could sit in our armchairs without really without doing any kind of experiments or anything like that, and sort of reason from first principles, like a priori,
Right.
deduce something about the nature of our universe. That was what, to me, was so
I'm
tantalizing.
skeptical about. I'm really suspicious whenever anybody says we can learn something without experiencing anything.
Right.
What is the simulation argument here, so that you can sort of explain it to me how you understand it?
Okay, I'll tell you how I understand it. So this comes from a paper by Nick Bostrom, famous contemporary philosopher. His argument is, it seems, just from the empirical evidence we have looking around us at the world, it seems not entirely implausible that at some point in the future, some civilization on Earth is going to become advanced enough to have computer technology that can simulate conscious beings just inside the computer. Not just the conscious beings, but sort of a simulated universe for those simulated entities to exist within. And they can interact with each other and interact with their simulated universe and everything. So, I mean, he's not saying this will happen, but just that it seems not entirely unlikely based on what we see around us. If that happens, he's also assuming that it's not entirely unlikely that some civilization is going to want to run past simulations. So it's not that they're going to be simulating an entirely new universe just out of whole cloth, but that they're going to want, for purposes either of entertainment or study, to simulate the past trajectory of Earth. So basically, the simulated universe that they would be running, these future Earthlings, on their computers, would be like a replay of the past timeline of Earth.
Right.
So if those two conditions hold, then they run multiple simulations, then Bostrom points out the number of simulated beings, the number of simulated Earthlings, is going to vastly outnumber the number of actual real past Earthlings who lived. I mean, so if they run one simulation, then you sort of have the equivalent numbers of past Earthlings and simulated Earthlings. But if they run multiple simulations, then you can see how it quickly becomes, the odds start getting tilted in favor of the simulated beings. So the conclusion of all this is, looking around us at our world, how do we know that we're not in one of the simulations that future Earthlings run? And more than that, it's not just how do we know we're not, but maybe we should think it's more likely that we actually are, because there's so many more of the simulated ones than the unsimulated ones.
And that's where it seems to fall apart for me.
Okay, why?
I can accept the idea that it's logically consistent that we could be a simulation, but I don't understand how evidence that we see in this world of these potential simulations could be used as evidence for or against the probability that we are. How confident we should think this is a real world and not a simulation. I don't see how his arguments lead us to be more or less confident that we're in a simulation.
So are you saying that you don't see how we can reason about the likelihood that we're in a simulation based on the empirical evidence in our world?
Yes.
Because if we're in a simulation, then it's simulated evidence? Is that the idea?
So what exactly are we comparing here? A simulation which exactly replicates the conditions we see versus reality, which is exactly what we see? Because if that's the two things we're comparing, then no amount of evidence can give us more confidence for one hypothesis over the other. If there's some kind of difference that we would experience, then we can start to think about likelihoods and probabilities that we're in a simulation versus reality. But if we are in a simulation, then it seems it's a simulation exactly like reality would be. and we can't distinguish the two from within.
Well, we can't distinguish them based on empirical observations of the world around us, because you're right, those would be just by stipulation of the assumption that that the future Earthlings are running exact simulations of the past. They would be identical. The simulated past would be the same as the actual past, so we couldn't tell. But I think the argument you were alluding to about how can we use evidence from within the simulation to reason about the likelihood we're in a simulation. So if we are in a simulation, then clearly, like, the simulation argument's already won, right? And if we're not sure whether we're in a simulation, well, maybe I should put it this way. I think the important piece that gets lost often in these discussions is that we've assumed that the simulated Earth and the past Earth are going to be the same. So, I mean, we don't know for sure, but if they are the same, then we can reason about, then, like, the evidence around us in the simulation is the same as the evidence of the past Earthlings.
Yeah.
So we can use it to reason about the likelihood of a simulation happening. Does that make sense?
So one of the things I was reading in one of his shorter pieces on this is that I think this actually more came from my friend Mike arguing it, that we see all of these simulated beings, hypothetical simulated beings, experiencing the exact same thing that we're experiencing. And we know that in that condition, they are simulations. So we see a million cases, hypothetically, in which somebody is experiencing what we're experiencing, and we know that that is correlated to being in a simulation.
Are we an external observer in this?
Yes.
Okay.
Assuming that we're in the future and we are running the simulation.
Right, okay, go on.
So let's say that we are running a simulation, and we decide to start changing things a little bit. And we run 1 billion simulations in which every time our sims touch a diamond, they get an electric shock. So we see that in 1 billion cases now, a person about to touch a diamond is going to receive an electric shock.
Mm-hmm.
Do we then, outside of the simulation, say, ooh, I better not touch diamonds because I've noticed that in those conditions, we're likely to get shocked? No, we recognize that the simulation isn't any evidence for what we are experiencing. So it seems like a lot of it falls apart when we try to use simulated evidence towards our own reality.
So in this thought experiment, the simulation is not a replication of the past, right?
Right.
Okay. So I think that's a little different from what Bostrom's saying. I mean, clearly, like, of course you can't, if you create a fake world, it doesn't make sense to use evidence from your fake world to reason about your real world. It's just, I think the crux of his argument is in this link, that we're running replications, not new worlds, with new rules and new, dangerous diamonds. But the problem for me... Sorry.
Mm-hmm. What observations make it more likely that we are make us think we are more likely to be in a simulation? What are these observations that he's saying are correlated with being in a simulation?
I guess the trajectory of artificial intelligence research and computing power would be evidence. Mm-hmm. So if it seems like artificial intelligence is progressing really rapidly, then it seems increasingly likely that some civilization will have the ability at some point to run these simulations. What else? I mean, the likelihood that we're going to kill ourselves at some point, that we're going to all blow each other up before this technology develops, right? And also the likelihood, I guess, the degree of inclination we feel to run past simulations. Because if we think that running past simulations, or like past replications of past Earth, would be a cool and educational thing to do, then it seems a little more likely that some future Earthlings might think the same thing. Does that make sense?
I'm still having trouble with the jump between saying that it is evidence that at some point there will be simulations, mm-hmm. and somehow using that as evidence about our own experience. He seems to be making the jump that the beings experiencing something in a simulation would be in a simulation, and therefore we can use that likelihood to make guesses about our own experiences. And that doesn't seem to be something that we can do.
I think we can only do it if the real past Earth evidence is the same as the evidence inside the simulation. But so let me tell you, for me, what the real dubious, like the weak link here is. Well, aside from the fact that I'm not at all confident that it's at all plausible that we would one day be able to make realistic simulations with billions of conscious entities and a really complex, sophisticated universe. Like, setting that empirical
Actually,
question
there's
aside.
only one. It's just me. You're not really simulated. I'm the only simulated being. It's all set up from my point of view. It's a much simpler program than you think.
Yeah, so that's a whole other can of worms. Let's do the solipsism video another day. But so for me, the problem that I'm still trying to figure out how to think about this, the main logical problem, as opposed to empirical one, is how similar the replication actually has to be. Like, because as I've been saying, it seems like for us to be able to reason about the likelihood of us being in a simulation based on the evidence around us, as I said, past Earth, real Earth has to be pretty much identical to simulated past Earth. But I don't know how identical is identical enough for this argument to work. You know, like, what if, like, they're identical except a bird flies left instead of right on one day in the simulation instead, you know, whereas it flew right instead of left in the real world. Like, that can't possibly make any difference to the argument. But that's at one end of the spectrum, and as you start increasing the differences between the simulated past Earth and the real past Earth, then I don't really know when the argument starts to fall apart.